Okay, now we are being recorded. One moment. Last time that I recorded, it was recorded in gallery view. I just want to make sure that this time I record correctly. Okay, it's not happening. Anyhow, the host is going to record us. Okay, so we were speaking about spiritual nutrients. We started from self-awareness. We talked pretty much a lot about self-awareness, and then we started to talk about last week about some obstacles, some common obstacles to self-awareness. We named a few of them. One of the important ones was the reaction of shame. We said what is the difference between the shame and guilt. We said how guilt could be a constructive feeling if it leads to making amends and um, making a resolution not to repeat that mistake again. And we said, what is the way to release the feeling of guilt? And what is the difference between guilt and shame? Another obstacle, another common obstacle to self awareness is the reaction of blame, which we couldn't discuss last week. So, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to talk about the reaction of blame now. Rabbi Twersky once said, half in jest, meaning half jokingly, half serious, that one needs four things instead of three essential things in life: food and water, number one; shelter, number two; clothing, number three, and number four, someone or something to blame. This shows that blaming is a common problem pretty much for for humankind, we can say, the problem of blame. So what is blaming? People often blame someone because of the negative feeling or behavior or thought that's experienced by the blamer. For example, we might blame someone because they pressured us to make a decision, or they caused us to be late, for example, or made us angry. This is some of the common things that people say and then blame somebody because of it. So basically, blaming is assigning fault to someone else because of a negative feeling that we experience. Like a lot of other adult habits, blaming also comes from early childhood development when the person didn't learn some of the self-soothing abilities to deal with negative emotions, especially shame, something we talked a lot about last time. But blaming can also be directed towards ourselves. Remember when we spoke about guilt last week? We said that guilt could be constructive when we know how to release it, how to fix it. But guilt can also be destructive. When is it destructive? When you don't know how to release it. When you don't let go of it and stay with that feeling and keep blaming and blaming and blaming yourself. That is an expression of the negative side of guilt. So we can say that blaming ourselves, self-blame, and blaming others are two sides of a pendulum of blaming, two sides of the same coin, we can also say. They both come from person's ability or to deal with negative emotion, trying to the feeling of shame, for example, that she's experiencing. And the person who keeps blaming herself will develop a negative image of self. The opposite of what we have been talking about, having a high sense of self-worth. So this is blame. Now we want to address how to overcome this reaction of blame. One of we can say the general antidote or medicine to the reaction of blame, which comes from Torah, is one word, emunah. Something that we've all heard about, faith. Now, books have been written about this topic and are being written, and we won't be able to cover the topic of emunah in length in one session, but we want to discuss emunah as it relates to the reaction of blame. We want to see what is the connection between them. In a nutshell, what is it? Rav Aruna, there is a basic level in faith to believe that Hashem only king of the world, and every event that happens comes from Hashem, and also everything that doesn't happen. Everything comes from Hashem. This is basic level. What is one level higher? The intermediate level. The intermediate level is when the person has a solid basic level emunah, and in addition to that, also has a firm belief that everything that comes from Hashem is for good. This is intermediate level. And what is one level higher? The upper level. This person, in addition to solid basic emunah and solid intermediate emunah, also has firm faith that everything that comes from Hashem has a purpose, has a rationale, even if we don't understand it, has a message for us. If you want to give an example of this, I heard, I don't know if you heard about Seila Guess, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. This lady, I think 31 or 32 years old, in her 30s, from Israel, from Yehuda v'Shomron. She was in labor while they were driving to a hospital with her husband. They were shot by terrorists, and she was killed on the spot, and she was pregnant, so they had to do C-section on her. They delivered the baby, and I think for about 2 weeks, the doctors were trying to keep the baby alive, and eventually he passed away. Her husband, Hananel, there's a famous podcast, if anybody knows about, Living L'Chaim podcast. Have you heard about it? Have you watched any episode? I really recommend this podcast.
Oh, yes, it's amazing.
You can watch it. Yeah, it's amazing. You can watch it on YouTube. Also, podcast if you have an iPhone, the podcast app. So there was an episode that they invited Hananel. First of all, I was shocked. How come this man, after such a tragedy, is functioning enough to be able to speak on the podcast? This was still pretty early after the tragedy. At one point, he said, somebody asked, what is the name of the podcast? Living L'Chaim. I'm going to send the link in the group. I'm going to send actually the link to that episode in the group. Bezrat Hashem. So while this man was in tremendous pain, he said, I believe, I have emunah, that this came from Hashem, and somehow it is tovah. It is for good. I don't know how, but I believe that whatever Hashem does is for good. Doesn't mean that I don't feel the pain. This is what he said. You need to give a space for that emotion, for that pain, and feel it, because otherwise it can lead to other negative emotions like anger, like rage. But he said he has emunah that everything is from Hashem and he did the tovah. It gave me goosebumps, and the guy who was interviewing him was crying while he was speaking. We should pray, please, Hashem, we should never be in a situation terrible like that for our emunah to be tested. But that man in our time is a living example of emunah, to have such high faith that everything that happens, regardless of how I feel about it, whether I see it as good or not, comes from Hashem. And it's for good. Obviously, good here is something that I might not be able to understand. How can such a thing be good? And it has a message, it has a rationale. This is an example of emunah. It's also one of the 13 principles of faith. If you look at the Siddur, at the end of morning prayers, there's 13 principles of faith brought by Rambam. The first one is, I believe with complete emunah that the Creator, blessed be His name, is the Creator and ruler of all the creations, and He alone did, does, and will do every single deed. So basically, when we have emunah, we assign the cause to God, because we see God as the cause of all causes. We say sibat sibot. He is He's the only master of reality. Whatever is happening is coming from Him. And when we believe that everything is coming from Hashem, in such a mentality, there's no place for blaming. Why? Because if Hashem is the cause, so every other person, every other event is just like a messenger or like an agent for that event to happen. In such a life, there's no place for blaming. Not blaming others and not blaming yourself. Why there is no place for blaming yourself? Because you have faith or emunah in Hashem's mercy, in Hashem's forgiveness. A person who blames herself and cannot release the guilt, deep down also doesn't believe that Hashem will forgive her. So somebody with real strong emunah won't fall in the trap of self-blame, because she has faith in Hashem's mercy and forgiveness. And also such a person will not blame others, because she sees Hashem as the cause of all causes, meaning everything that comes from Hashem. Obviously, all of this is easier said than done. Emunah is like a muscle, something that we need to God, not in a tragedy like that. And that has emunah in this situation says, this is also from Hashem. You don't get angry at the car or the driver. This is a life with emunah. This is a general antidote to blaming. But now we want to speak about a more specific antidote to the reaction of blame. This is a teaching from the Ba'al Shem Tov, the founder of the Chassidic movement, which is sometimes, this lesson is sometimes referred to as the mirror principle. Now, this mirror principle, perhaps we can say that it's more directly related to judging than blaming. And judging and blaming are distinct concepts, but they're also related, with judging being the foundation of blaming. Judging comes before blaming. Why? Because judging is forming an opinion, having an assessment about something or a person. Blaming is assigning fault to a person. They are related. So what is this lesson, this mirror principle? The Ba'al Shem Tov said that the world is like a mirror. Whatever we see in another person as defect is actually a reflection of a defect in ourselves. When we see fault in others, we are actually seeing our own imperfections. I put this saying from the Ba'al Shem Tov in the source sheet from last week because I thought we were going to discuss it last week. So you can find it on last week's source sheet. It says, your fellow is your mirror. If your own face is clean, the image you perceive will also be flawless. But should you look upon your fellow man and see a blemish, it is your own imperfection that you are encountering. You are being shown what it is that you must correct within yourself. The Ba'al Shem Tov is basically teaching us an important psychological insight. People, to the degree that we are in denial of our own reality, of our own character defects, we might find it easier to see it in other people. That's why the Baal Shem Tov says that the world is a mirror. The fault that we see in others is actually a reflection of our own faults. Now, you might say, okay, I understand in some situations it might be harder for myself to see something in me, but in another person I can see it sometimes. But why do we call it a principle? Because principle makes it sound like it's a general rule that's always like this. Could be that sometimes you just witness something, a certain behavior, which has nothing to do with you. Let's say you are you're grocery shopping, and while you're in the line, you see that the person ahead of you is being rude to the cashier, and she says something mean to the cashier. You're just the next person in line. It has nothing to do with you. You just happen to be there and you witness that event. So what does it have to do with you? You just saw someone in rage. Why does it mean that you also have a problem controlling your anger? What does it have to do with you? There is something called the selective filter of mind. How does it work? Imagine we put a certain number of people, let's say 10 people, on a busy corner of a street. Let's say we ask 10 people to stay on Bathurst and Stills for, I don't know, for 20 minutes. And then after 20 minutes, we ask them, what did you see? They were all in the same place and they were witness to same events, but the answer that they will give will be different. Why is that? At any moment, our brain is being bombarded with a lot of stimuli. There's so many things happening and our senses are receiving so many information. Now, if there would be no filter and our brain would receive everything, we would be overwhelmed and the brain wouldn't be able to function normally. So we have a selective filter that decides which stimuli we are gonna receive. This is the filtering system of the mind that decides what to block out and what to receive among countless stimuli happening around us. So the Ba'al Shem Tov is saying that selective filter is not random. There must be some reason why your mind blocks out certain stimuli and decides to receive other stimuli or accept other stimuli. So this filtering system is not random. And he says it has to do with what your soul needs to receive, what your soul needs to learn. So it's not random. This selectivity is decided by our character trait. if I happen to be somewhere in a gathering or in a supermarket and I witness something that happens and I receive it, I pay attention, it grabs my attention, it's not random because nothing in this world is an accident. If I happened to be there, which is just called happen to be there, it means that I needed to see that to learn a lesson from it. And this is also a practical lesson for lashon hara or derogatory speech when someone speaks negatively about somebody else. Why is a practical lesson and a good way to avoid lashon hara? Because in this mindset, if I talk about a negative character trait that I think somebody else has, what does it say? It says that I also have it. Maybe not to that level, maybe not as pronounced, but somewhere in my soul, it exists. Maybe not in the same context, maybe in a different manner. So why would a person say lashon hara? Because in this sense, saying lashon hara is basically admitting to your own character defects. So why would someone do that? Now, more about this mirror principle. How does a mirror principle work? The mirror principle works on two levels. There are two ways that it works. One way is that our actions here on earth affect the worlds above, the Shamayim, the heavens above. And the mirror principle will show us whether our actions are having a positive effect or a negative effect. This is one way. We can call it as above, so below. What is the second way that it works? The second way shows how we are coming across to others. And an example. What is an example of first type? An example of first type could be, let's say somebody spends a lot of time shopping, window shopping or actual shopping in malls. And it's coming at the expense of time that needs to be spent on other areas of life, attention that needs to be given to other relationships in our lives. Imagine a lady who's spending a lot of time in malls. Now, this excess that's being spent there, this extra time, this overindulgence is being accounted in heavens because the spiritual world is a reflection of the physical world and the opposite. So this excess is accounted above and eventually will be felt here and reflected here on something physical that happens. For example, could be that one day this person slips in the mall. Nothing happens to her. She just slips and maybe gets a little bit dirty. Now, most people probably won't pay attention to it, won't see it in this way, but a spiritually aware person will look at it as what message I need to learn from this? What lesson is it teaching me? And then we'll do what we call a cheshbon nefesh, an accounting of one's self. How much time I'm spending on this activity? Does it mean that perhaps I'm not giving enough attention to other areas of life? This is the reaction of a spiritually aware person. As above, so below. This is level one type, we can say. What is the second type that mirror principle works? And perhaps this second type is easier for people to understand. The first type sounds more spiritual. The second type is that we see, as we said, our own character defects in other people. Another example. This is a pretty personal example. Let's say I watch something on social media, a video of somebody speaking negatively. Let's say a video of a Jew speaking negatively about another Jew. For, I don't know for what. Let's say because they keep a certain mitzvah in different ways. This happens a lot. I don't want to open it more so that people won't be able to say possibly what I'm talking about. But let's say I see something like that and I see it as bad behavior. And I say, why is she speaking like that? This is mean. Why is she judging the other person like that? This is the basic reaction that we could have. What does the mirror principle here tells me? The mirror principle forces me to look inside and ask myself, wait a minute, am I showing that behavior, perhaps sometimes, not as pronounced? The way the mirror principle works is that it shows what you might be doing in another person to you, sometimes in a way that's much more exaggerated, so that you will pay attention to it and you will really see how bad it feels. It doesn't mean that you do exactly the same thing in the same circumstances, in the same area. Could be that this person was judging someone negatively, I don't know, in a way she's keeping a mitzvah, let's say. Could be that I don't do that. I don't judge people in that area, or I don't even say it, but maybe in another area, in my mind, in my heart, maybe silently, secretly, maybe I have those judgmental moments. And now the mirror principle is showing me by that video that I think randomly just popped up on my field, is showing me how unpleasant that character trait look from the other person's perspective. It shows us how sometimes we come across to other people. Again, not necessarily as pronounced and as severe, not necessarily in the same area, but pretty much something similar to it, maybe in a different area. So, what we see in others, the bad that we see in others, is a lesson for ourselves to look inwards. And this is also another reflection of emunah, because at the end of the day, when you see, when you, instead of blaming the other person and judging the other person, look inwards and try to find where I see something similar in myself, you're acknowledging that what you saw was just a lesson coming from Hashem. So that person was just a messenger. This is how the mirror principle works. It's another reflection of emunah. A lot of times in our lives, children are our mirrors. Children are chosen for every couple to reflect us. A lot of time to fix that trait in our comes to your life that you find annoying with a certain behavior. And after you do that inner work with the mirror principle, then you will see that sometimes the person will drift away from your life. Why? Because they had a certain role, the role of being a mirror to reflect to you a certain area in your personality that you needed to work on. And after you got the message and you did the work, that person has already served their purpose in that relationship. So the relationship could fade from your life. In this sense, we see every opportunity that we witness, not directly necessarily, even something that we witness, let's say in the grocery store, as a message from God and as an opportunity for ourselves to take a step towards removing something negative from our character traits. This is the mirror principle. And as I said, it's more directly connected to judging than blaming, but judging and blaming, at the end of the day, even though they're distinct, they're connected. And now we want to move to our next topic. Let's zoom out for a moment, say what we were talking about. We said we were talking about spiritual nutrients. What were the spiritual nutrients? We said these are uniquely human traits. The sum total of these uniquely human traits make what we call human spirit or soul. And each of these spiritual nutrients is an area for us to strive to become better, is an area for self-improvement. And we said that the source of real happiness comes from self-improvement. That's how we are looking at the spiritual nutrients. So what is the next spiritual nutrient that we want to talk about? The next spiritual nutrient is the ability to be humble. I know it sounds very different from what we have been discussing until now. Self-worth, having a positive view of oneself, finding good points in oneself, and now suddenly we are shifting perspective, being humble. You will see how they relate at the end, and you will see why it's important to have both of these character traits. So what is the ability to be humble? One of the uniquely human traits that makes us human. The opposite of it, vanity. You know, animals sometimes display some behaviors that might be interpreted as vanity. For example, the peacock with showing off that beautiful big tail, colorful tail. But they definitely don't show any sign of having the ability to be humble. This is a uniquely human trait. What is humility? First of all, what is the relationship between humility and self-worth? Because a lot of times people think if somebody is humble, they don't have a high sense of self-worth, which is not true. Because humility, if it's real humility, not fake humility, if it's coming from a real place, deep in your core, it's not the same thing as having low self-worth. Because it's a lack of arrogance. It's understanding one's place in the bigger context in the world. It's a recognition of a larger reality in our lives. But what is low self-esteem? Low self-esteem is, unlike humility, which is not about self, low self-worth is about self, is self-focused, is having a deep-seated feeling of not being good enough, not being lovable enough, feeling of inadequacy. But humility, on the other hand, we said it's not about ourselves. It's coming from a firm belief or emunah that God has created me the way I am, with my strengths and with my weaknesses. And He has a plan for me in life. Whoever I am comes from God. It's an acceptance of our imperfections in life, an understanding that we are not perfect. And we said whatever that we discuss here, all of these topics of self-improvement,
Now, I think that, and then I'm gonna go grab my adult and also. Boris said he's gonna meet me up with Rabbi Sivinsky.
I'm gonna ask the
But
host
he said he wants to meet up around like 9:35.
whoever
He said.
forgot to mute themselves. Okay.
Yeah, and I spoke to Yeshua. What's his name? He said he's gonna try to come, but he said it's definitely a good idea. I said he's willing to help.
Okay. Now I also got muted. Okay, so we said that we should have always one principle in mind, that whatever we say about becoming the best version of ourselves, we need to keep in mind that the best version of ourselves is not perfect. We want to try to become our best while we're embracing our imperfections. So in a nutshell, in order to become the best version of ourselves, in order to improve our relationships with people around us and get closer to Hashem, this is the topic of our circle, improving our relationships, we need to live by both of these lessons. The lessons of nekudah tovah, which we discussed last time, seeing the good points in ourselves, and the lesson of humility. Now, why and how? Why we need both? How we incorporate both of them in our life, we will see later. But first, we wanna discuss about humility from a Torah perspective. Let's start from a story time. One day, the Chafetz Chaim was on a train. Chafetz Chaim was a big Torah scholar. He was on a train to go to a city where he had a shiur or a lecture. There was another Jewish man who was on the train and happened to sit next to him. And they had a conversation. The Chafetz Chaim asked him where he was going. The man didn't know that he was Chafetz Chaim. He said, I'm going to such and such city to meet the Chafetz Chaim. He has a lecture. He's the biggest tzaddik, the biggest righteous person of the Jewish community in our times. The Chafetz Chaim, who was a humble man, felt embarrassed by hearing this. And he said to this man, you're exaggerating. I know him personally very well, and he's not that great. People exaggerate. The man felt infuriated by this and slapped Chafetz Chaim in the face. He felt angry that he disrespected the great tzaddik. Chafetz Chaim didn't say anything. He arrived in his destination and went to his lecture. The man also went, and he was shocked to see that this rabbi, the great tzaddik, for whom he came to the city, was the man sitting next to him on the train, the Chafetz Chaim. Right after the lecture finished, the man went to Chafetz Chaim and apologized. He felt really embarrassed by what he did. He slapped the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim told him, no worry, you don't need to apologize. First of all, you were defending me. Secondly, you taught me a big lesson. Chafetz Chaim has written a lot about Lashon Hara, the halachot, the laws of Lashon Hara, how not to have derogatory speech, how to keep our tongue, basically. This is one of his greatest works. So he wrote a lot about Lashon Hara. He said, all my life I've been teaching people how not to defame others, not to speak bad about others. But now I learned you shouldn't also speak negatively about yourself. So humility isn't just acknowledging that which we are not. It's also recognizing that which we are. We need both of it. And the caveat to that is that we want to acknowledge and recognize who we are and connect it to Hashem, realizing that whatever it is, it's not me. It's coming from Hashem. Let's say this learning circle tonight. Whether it goes well or not, it's not from me. It's from Hashem. If it's successful, it's from Hashem. I was just a vessel to deliver the information. And if it turns out not as I was hoping, still, it's from Hashem. Everything is coming from Hashem. Now, the opposite of humility, vanity. I think we have all experienced being in the presence of somebody who's full of herself, bragging all the time about their achievements or what their belongings, and it's not a pleasant feeling. On the other hand, being a vain person also doesn't feel pleasant. Such a person doesn't have real happiness in life. Vanity is the hallmark of a narcissistic personality. The term narcissism comes from a Greek myth of Narcissus. Who was Narcissus in the Greek mythology? He was a handsome guy that was known for his handsomeness, but he was also known for his indifference to everybody who wanted to approach him, including all the women who wanted to show their love to him. He was indifferent to everybody until one day he was passing by a clear pool of water and he saw his own reflection in the water. And guess what? He fell in love with his own reflection in the water. He was consumed by that fascination, which he couldn't possess. He couldn't possess the image in the water. And the myth says that he stayed there until he was consumed by this love. He died there. The myth says that then his body was transformed into a flower, narcissus flower, this flower in the water that's facing down, as a symbol of his obsession with his own image. That's why this flower is always looking in the water at its own image. Now, obviously, this is a myth. It's not a real story, but it's a cautionary tale against being overly obsessed with your own image, with who you are, over admiration of oneself. This term actually it's not accurate because such a person, a vain person, might look that has great love and admiration for themselves, but deep down, that vanity is just a facade. It's a mask to cover feelings of inadequacy. So even though it comes from that myth, the term itself is not real. Whereas we said humility, somebody who's really humble doesn't have a negative image of self, doesn't have low self-worth. But somebody who's vain actually does not have a high self-worth. And the vanity is just a show to cover a void inside. Such a person obviously cannot develop good relationships in life. Why? Because no matter how much you try to show to a vain person, a person full of themselves, a person that appears full of themselves, that you love them, it's never enough because deep down, they themselves don't feel lovable. And such a person has a roadblock from the get-go in building and nurturing relationships, particularly in getting closer to Hashem. A person who's full of themselves is not open to learning, is not open to growing. So they can definitely not be a spiritual person. And for sure, not a genuinely happy person. Remember that we said the real happiness comes from living a spiritual life. And we said this is different from living a religious life necessarily. We mean a spiritual in the sense of being on a journey of becoming the best version of yourself. Why we need it as a spiritual nutrient? The reasons are obvious. One of the basic ones is the ability to learn. If we want to become better, we need to be open to receive. A humble person is the vessel that can receive. We need to be able to ask for help. We said we can't be on this journey alone. And a person who is not humble cannot accept help genuinely. And a person that cannot accept help also cannot offer help. I don't know if you've ever experienced an offer of help from someone where you detect a sense of superiority, which makes you feel uncomfortable to receive that help, to accept it. Because a vain person, when offers help. Oh, we disconnected. Okay. Does everybody hear me? My connection is not as stable where I am.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So we need to be humble enough to admit mistakes. And I don't know if any of you here is familiar with baseball. Where I grew up, baseball was not the popular game. Everybody watches soccer where I grew up. But those of you who are from US at least, I know that baseball is popular there. So apparently baseball is the only game where errors are counted in the scoring system. How it works is that the top players in baseball only hit the ball safely in 30% of the times. What it means is that in 70% of the times, they are not perfect. And that's why life is like a baseball game. Errors are part of the game. All of this was an introduction to get to humility in the Torah sources. And for that, you have a source sheet. Just a look at the time. Wow, time flies. Does anybody have the source sheet? Okay. I also want to put the source sheet in front of me. We are not going to go through everything that's on the source sheet, as I told you before. But I want to draw your attention to the first one. This is from Pirkei Avot, the ethics of fathers. I read the English only. Rabbi Levitas, a man of Yavne, would say, "Be very, very humble in spirit, for the hope of mortal man is with the worms." In Hebrew, this part is be very, very humble. Me'od, me'od, heve, shefal, ruach. Be very, very humble. Now, what does it mean, very, very humble? Why this repetition? In every character trait, our sages say that we should choose the middle place. For example, being generous. Being generous is a good thing, but there is something called being too generous, which is not good. A person who's too generous is a spendthrift, will end up with no money. And the person who lacks that to the other side of the extreme is a miser who can't spend anything. What about being merciful? We need to have mercy, but there is such a thing as being too merciful. What is the problem with that? A person that's too merciful at the end would also be merciful to the cruel people, which is, by the way, something that we see a lot in today's world. The world has lost its moral compass, and they think it's a good thing to be merciful with no limits. Even to people that want to annihilate us, we need to have mercy. We need to be kind to them. These are the same people that feel sympathy towards terrorists. But our Torah teaches us that no, there's a middle point in being merciful. Because if you're too merciful, you will be merciful also to the cruel. And if you're on the other side of the extreme, you won't have mercy to good people. So there is a middle place that you need to find. But there is one character trait, our sages say, that in this one you should go all the way, not middle place. And that's being humble. That's why it says, me'od me'od, very, very much. Be very, very humble. No middle way. Why? Because our sages say that pride, the opposite of humility, is the source of almost all the other negative character traits and all sins. Excuse me. I read part of it from the source sheet. If you look at the first one, where you see Pirkei Avot, it says Rabbeinu Yonah says, look at the fourth line where it says, and Rambam. What does the Rambam say? And Rambam, does anybody see where I'm reading? can you just confirm if you can find this place on your source sheet?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. And Rambam, may his memory be blessed, explained that he came to inform us that even though the middle point in all of the traits is the praiseworthy, like the trait of generosity, since both the spendthrift and the miser are bad, and the middle is the right choice, and so with the trait of cruelty, that a person should not be cruel and also not completely merciful, as he should not have mercy on the wicked, and not be cruel to other people. Rather, the middle is the good path, to be merciful, but to be cruel when needed, and so too totally with all other traits. A man should grab the middle path and the moderate trait. Yet this trait of haughtiness, of pride, must be removed from oneself to the far extreme. And there is no trait more problematic than it. And most of the sins of the Torah depend upon it. And moreover, it causes forgetfulness of the Creator. This is what I wanted to focus on. Having pride, not being humble, makes us forget Hashem in our life because we become too preoccupied with ourselves. And this is the root of all the other problems. As I told you, we're going to skip the other two, but I want you to look at because this is the main thing that we want to discuss, main source of humility in the Torah. Page 2 of your source sheet, Bamidbar, Miriam and Aaron spoke to one another. If you can't find it in the source sheet, it's also okay. I will tell you the story. Moshe Rabbeinu, this is about humility of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu had a lot of great character traits. But one of his greatest character traits was his humility. In the Torah, he is referred to as the humblest of all men. What is his humility? What type of humility Moshe Rabbeinu has? To learn this, we need to look at these verses that I put for you here. Moshe Rabbeinu was on such a high level of prophecy that he was talking to God all the time. At some point, he decided that he won't be with his wife anymore. He wanted to be ready at any moment to receive prophecy. His brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, who were also prophets, saw this as something negative. And they told to each other, why is Moshe doing this? We should also do this. God spoke with us too. This is what they say. Miriam and Aaron spoke to one another against Moshe regarding how he had divorced the Cushite woman he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. They said, this is verse number 2, Bet, on the second page of your source sheet. They said, has God spoken only to Moses? Has he not spoken to us too? And God heard this. I have highlighted these parts for you. They said something, and God heard. Then the Torah says, now Moses was a very humble man, more than any other man that was upon the face of the earth. Next pasuk, next verse says, God suddenly said to Moses, Aharon and Miriam, come out, all three of you, to the tent of meeting. And all three went out. So what happened was that they said something to Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say anything. They said something. The Torah says God heard. This is pasuk 2, verse 2. Verse 3 here sounds a little bit out of context. It disrupts the sequence of the story. In the middle of this narrative, it says Moshe Rabbeinu was a very humble man. This man, Moshe, was very humble. And then it says God answered that. What is happening here? This is the key to understanding Moshe Rabbeinu's humility. Now, before this, a little bit flashback. In the previous chapter, there was an episode where the Israelites were in Midbar, in the desert. We know what they were eating in the desert. They were receiving manna, the bread from heaven. At one point, they got tired from this manna. They said, we want the fish that we had in Egypt. We want meat. We miss the taste of meat. We want meat. And Moshe got agitated. He didn't like what they said. He reacted to this. So how come now that they are speaking to him directly in a negative way, they're judging him? How come he's so calm? He doesn't say anything. There are two main questions here. First of all, why is this verse that Moshe was a humble man in the middle of this story? Why is it disrupting the sequence of the events? And secondly, like what I said, why is he so calm here? Whereas previously, when people complained about manna and they said we want meat, he got agitated. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that the questions answer another. They answer one another. In the episode of complaining about manna and requesting meat, people's challenge, people's complaint was not directed towards Moshe Rabbeinu. It was directed towards God or fate or circumstances, not against Moshe personally. That's why he cared what they said and he got agitated. But here, what Miriam and Aaron are saying, oh, has God only spoken to Moshe? He has also spoken to us. So why is he doing this? Here, what they are saying is personal, is directed towards Moshe himself. That's why he doesn't react. That's why he's so calm. What it means is that this explains why Moshe was humble. It means that he did not care about himself. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't care about himself. If he cared, in fact, he wouldn't handle being the leader of this nation even for one day. He cared about God. He cared about the cause that they had, the deliverance from Egypt. He cared about leading the nation. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, humility is mindlessness of self. This is an anav. Anav is the biblical word for a humble person. It's not what people think. It's not having low self-worth or feeling of self-deprecation, self-abasement. It's not self anything. It's not about self. It's about something greater than yourself, a bigger reality, a greater context. Moshe Rabbeinu thought about God so much that he didn't think about himself. He took God so seriously that he didn't need to take himself seriously. So this is humility, the ability to stand in silent awe in the presence of something greater than you, the awe of Hashem, the majesty, the glory of creation, the otherness of other people, the greatness of big ideas. Humility is that feeling. Have you been to Niagara Falls? I think most of you live either in Toronto or in New York. You've been to Niagara Falls. When you look at the Niagara Falls, especially if you take that boat, which is called Journey Behind the Falls, you go very, very close to the falls, and you see this majesty of the creation. That is a moment that makes you feel humble. Obviously, it doesn't mean that, oh, you feel low self-worth. No, humility is that moment when you look at this majesty of creation, of work of Hashem, and you tell yourself, Ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem. How big are the works of your hands? How big are your creations, Hashem? How great are your works? You have made them all with wisdom. The earth is full of your possession. Ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem. Kulam bechokma asita mal'a haaretz kinyanecha. Humility is the ability to be in this silent awe of that which is greater than you. In a nutshell, humility is recognizing our insignificance vis-a-vis God. So it's not about self. It's not what people think, having low sense of self-love or negative self-image. Oh, it's already 8:43. I wanted to discuss at the end what is the relationship between nekudah tovah, the lesson of Azamra, finding our good points, as we discussed last time, in last session, and humility, how they relate to each other. But I realized that it's been over an hour and it's pretty late, so I don't want to keep you more than this. Bezrat Hashem, we will continue the relationship between these two, but I want to give you an introduction. Let's say a hint, not an introduction. The hint in learning the connection between these two, how humility and nekudah tovah, seeing your good point, recognizing your good point, relate to each other, lies in the secret of Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, the paradox of Mount Sinai. There's a famous midrash that says Hashem chose to give us the Torah on Mount Sinai because Mount Sinai was the smallest of the mountains. And this was a lesson from Hashem to us that in order to receive the Torah, you need to be humble, like Mount Sinai, which was the smallest of the mountains. But then you should ask a question. If the goal was to teach me the lesson to be humble, to see myself as insignificant vis-a-vis Hashem, why choose a mountain to begin with? Why not give the Torah on flat land, or even better, valley, even more humble? So I'm not going to continue because it's a whole topic and it's pretty late, but this was just a hint that the answer to our question, the connection between being humble and seeing the nekudah tovah in yourself is in this paradox, the paradox of the small mountain of Mount Sinai. And Bezrat Hashem, we will open it more in our next circle. This circle honestly was a little bit harder for me because it's all on Zoom, and when it's in person, you have that not real time, but face-to-face connection. It's easier to feel the energy than on Zoom. But I really appreciate all of you taking from your precious time so late to come and join us in this circle. And the energy also comes through the screen. Obviously not like in person, but I can still feel it. I'm gonna pause the recording.